They had tied her to the baobab before dawn, before the sky could answer with color, as if whatever light might come would only make the lesson clearer. A woman without children was a blemish on the family's line, and blemishes had to be shown to the world. The tree's bark was knotted and ancient, its roots like the hands of ancestors holding the soil. Beneath it, the house of Fazenda Ventura slept in the gray hush, except for the hush's opposite, a deliberate coldfulness meant to teach. Nzinga walked the rows of corn like a shadow among shadows, his palms sliding over the damp leaves, watching for the way the fields breathed. He had been a man who learned to read the wind as others read scripture. That morning the wind smelled of smoke and wet earth, and the iron tang that came when men of weight passed by with hard purpose. He had left the stable before first light, as he always did, because animals could not wait for human ceremonies. He did not intend to be a witness. He did not know the plan at all. But from the edge of the field he saw the shape at the baobab, and felt a voice inside him, less a voice than a pull, a gravity he could not account for. There was a body, small and white against dark bark, the rope coiled like a lesson at its neck. The face below the cloth was Elvira's, pale in the pre-dawn, eyes closed as if sleep sickness had taken her. They had set her up as a warning for others, for the house's servants, for any woman who might fail to produce an heir, and most of all for Rodrigo's friends who needed to see what the colonel meant by honor. Rodrigo had been a man whose idea of honor was measured in acres and children, in the flattening of those who might complicate his line. In his mind, property demanded purity, failure demanded spectacle. Nzinga's hands tightened on the cornstalk he leaned against. He remembered Kalena's laugh like a bell, the soft discipline of Ekukui's fingers on his cheek before they were taken. Memory of them had become a thin kind of hunger he could carry like a stone. He had promised them, in the dark that followed their capture, that he would survive so that something of them would survive. He had made himself small to be useful, to last. He moved without noise. Up close, the scene said things that the distance could not. The rope had been tied with precision. There were footprints in the loam belonging to men who wore two souls and no mercy. He did not know who had stood watch. He saw, in the slight tremor of the woman's hands, what the hangers-on always forgot. A human being existed even under a punishment meant to erase that fact. He cut her down, because a hand that can free an animal from suffering learns the shape of rescue in its fingers. He had no oaths to swear to this woman. She had owned him at birth and called him by the name his mother had been forced to forget. Yet when his knife sliced the rope and the cloth fell away, and he lowered Elvira to the ground, he felt the small, clean rush of a man doing what he could. She gasped air like a person newly returned to water. She coughed and clung to the soft of the earth with the mechanical gratitude of the condemned who have been given back a chance. When her eyes found his, they were hollow with shame and something like surprise, as if the world had misjudged its coordinates and offered him, instead of a scaffolding of witnesses, a single palm to hold. They were alone beneath the baobab for a long moment, the cornfield humming at the distant edge of the plantation, the house a shape against what light crept over the land. No bells rang. No one came to claim the spectacle they had set in motion. The men who had tied her had left at the edges, or perhaps been called back to other errands. That silence felt less like relief than an accusation. They had expected everyone to look away, to let cruelty tidy itself into example. Elvira's hands trembled as she drew them up to her throat. Her voice, when it came, was a thin, astonished sound, less a plea and more a confession. "Why?" she asked, as if asking him why he had intervened would explain anything. Nzinga thought of his mother's hands, of Kalena's laugh. He thought of the day he had been brought to Fazenda Ventura, small and useless, and the way the colonel's idea of honor had reached into the room like smoke. "Because to leave you like that would make the tree a ledger of shame," he said. His voice was low. "Because I have known what is buried." She stared at him, at the warp of his face shaped by labor and grief, and for a sliver of a moment the plantation between them seemed to collapse. He could have put her down and walked away, but when she made to sit, her knees shaking, he steadied her. The touch of his hands on her shoulders made her flinch. She was an owner by law and a prisoner of rumor by custom, and his kindness felt to her like a theft. "What are you?" she began, and then the word she tried to form broke into something else. Elvira had lived most of her days within the Casa Grande, the big house with curtains and a husband who drank and a father who instructed people how to keep appearances. She had been taught the economy of keeping quiet, of offering smiles as currency. But when the cruelty had drawn that rope taut across her neck, something had snapped. Human beings can be taught to endure only so much until endurance itself becomes an offense. After he had dressed the bruises the rope left on her wrist and helped her to stand, she pressed a palm to the baobab's rough skin, as if the tree were an altar that had failed. "They said a woman who bears no child brings shame," she said, "not to him, but to the wood. They said life without fruit is not worth living." The words left like ash. They took her inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and wine. Elvira leaned into the side of the corridor and wept quietly, not tears of weakness, but of a shame so old it left her without words. The mistress of the plantation, white, titled, married to Coronel Rodrigo, sat on a bench as if she were a woman who had discovered all her strangers had shown their teeth at once. Nzinga was supposed to vanish into the background the minute she was behind closed doors. That was the way of things. He was a man carefully taught to be small and useful. But 3 hours later she found him in the stable, rolled down the blanket she had ordered for horses, and sat him down on a low stool and looked at him with a sort of fevered intent. He still smelled of corn and wet earth. She smelled of the house and of fear. Her hands, elegant and quick despite everything, reached into the pocket of her skirt and found a small bundle of papers, parchments that felt like the authority of her family in ink. She laid them in his palm. They were manumissions, she said, slow at first, then faster as if the words themselves were an urgency that had been held back. Promises that each man who had labored there, bound in various proof of forced birthright, would be set free. Not later, not when it was safe, immediately. Nzinga looked down at the paper. He had seen papers before, on the table where Rodrigo drank and signed. Papers could curse as easily as they could cure. The word free looked like an impossible fruit on the parchment. It might wither as soon as dawn came. "You are the one who cut me from the tree," Elvira said. "I am the one who can make you whole in law." She spoke as if bargaining in some marketplace where souls had price tags. But there was something else in her voice too, raw, a desperation that had nothing to do with self-preservation. "Help me remove him," she said, naming the man who had sent her to the rope. "I cannot live under him. I cannot, as his wife or his ornament. I have no child and I have no voice in his house. If you help me, if you remove him, I will sign these and place them in the hands of the people." Nzinga's mouth went dry. The idea of removing Coronel Rodrigo was not one of law, but of action. People were removed every day. They were beaten into absence, sold across the sea, or buried. To remove a man like Rodrigo from the society that formed him was to step into a space where a man could be killed. Nzinga thought of killing in the way men think of storms, something that happens and leaves everything in its path reordered. He remembered Kalena and Equiqui again, the way Kalena braided his hair in a loose, impatient knot and hummed the melody of their village. He remembered Equiqui dragging her small feet in a puddle and throwing her head back in delighted laughter when the sun found them. He had never asked why they were taken. He had only sworn he would do whatever it took for something of them to live. He had seen men die in ways that left clean records in the accounts of men like Rodrigo, and he had seen others die in silence and forgetfulness. To engineer a man's death was to add to the ledger of the plantation. But to leave Rodrigo in place was to allow the plantation's cruelty to continue, rope by rope, in lessons that would last generations. Elvira's eyes were hard. "You think me selfish," she said once. "You think I want to be a matron of a free household for vanity? I know what I was and what I could become. There is a difference between freeing someone as a whim and freeing them for a future that will bear fruit. I cannot be content with standing in the house while men are in chains." The word fruit surfaced like a theme they both could not avoid. Elvira's body had been measured by her ability to produce heirs. Nzinga had been measured by productivity and endurance. They had both been defined by outcomes. Now they spun that image between them and tried to change its meaning. Fruit, Nzinga thought, might be land that fed people. Fruit might be the law that named the free. Fruit might be a school where children read and learn the names they had been given. Fruit might be the memory of a life that refused to be a footnote in someone else's tale. "What of your husband?" Nzinga asked finally. "If he dies and the neighbors suspect, if Antonio Ferreira or others come, they will not only blame you, they will come for the land. They will come for those you free." Elvira's hands folded in her lap like the hands of a woman who had been given a set of questions she could not refuse. "I know," she said, "which is why I will not announce this until the papers are ready to be given. I will have allies. I will call on those who will stand to lose by Rodrigo's rule, men who profit now by violence. They will not stand with him when the small order of things shifts." She named names with careful breaths. Antonio Ferreira, a few neighbors who bore grudges. "And yet," she conceded, "some will come. There will be blood. There will be men who must stand with me." Nzinga felt the old muscle in his jaw tighten. He had led laborers before, had organized small acts of defiance. The sick day someone took in solidarity. Water buckets milked towards fields rather than toward the Casa Grande. Messages passed in the dark. But organizing for defense, raising men, training them, negotiating with sobas whose lines predated the arrival of colonels, required skills he had only half learned. He had a reputation among the workers not because he wanted it, but because he was careful and because his grief could be trusted to keep him steady. "Will you be free?" he asked, shockingly simple. "If he falls, will you really free them? Naming is one thing, keeping it in law is another." Elvira's fingers trembled over the edges of the manumissions. She swallowed. "Yes," she said, "I will sign in my hand. I will put the documents in the village square. I will begin to give land to those who have tilled it. I will end the practice of hiring out. I will build a school on the north field under the baobab." The name came out like a vow. She had wanted, she said, to name the school for those who could not be named. She had wanted a plaque that might speak the truth. Here, a different life was possible. They sat together in that stable for a long time. Outside, the plantation moved as if nothing had happened. Men swung tools, birds argued with the dawn. But inside, a plan was being born. Plans, Nzinga had learned, required two kinds of courage: the courage to act and the courage to accept what the action would mean after. He thought, in a way that always surprised him, of his father's voice. The fragments of it he had been allowed to keep. His father had once told him that freedom was not merely leaving a chain. It was building something to hold the absence that leaving created. Nzinga had never understood that until he had seen how children could be born into chains or into fields grown by a different kind of care. "Who else knows?" he asked finally. Elvira shook her head. "No one," she said. "And yet I cannot do this without witnesses when it matters. You have some respect among the people. If you will stand for the first step, I will begin to sign these. I will not promise you an easy life. I will promise you that I will keep my hand to my word." Nzinga thought of Kalena. He thought of Ekuqui. He thought of the way a small woman had been hung because she lacked fruit. He thought of how many other bodies had been used to explain a family's honor or to consolidate a man's line. He thought of land being given to those who had worked it with their hands but not been allowed the dignity of a name. He put his palm flat on the papers as if taking an oath. "If we do this," he said, "we do it knowing there will be cost. I will not hide that. I will not promise you a life without grief. I promise only that I will stand and that I will bring others to stand with me." They planned with the practicality of people who knew the world would not relent because of good intentions. They catalogued Rodrigo's habits, the routes he took, the nights he rode drunk to pretend power. They considered methods that might appear as accident: a stirrup left torn to the threads, a saddle strap caused to slip just so, a lantern whose oil was watered and therefore produced a smaller light, and a white steed startled in the dark. They argued about poison. Could they put something in his wine? Nzinga said poison led to suspicion that would hang over any freed life. An accident had the kind of plausible deniability that could protect the community if the papers were ready the next morning. They also talked about aftercare. They imagined the day when the plantation's gates would be unlocked, when the press of people freed would decide whether to stay on land that had birthed them with their backs or to walk toward the uncertain promise of cities and the coast. Elvira insisted on land grants and wages so that staying would be a real choice, not a trap of nostalgia or fear. As they mapped these things on a scrap of paper waxed with practicality, both felt the gravity of what they plotted. Nzinga had never wanted to be violent before he was forced into a place where violence was a living structure. Now he was being asked to produce an end to a man who had been the origin of a system that taught ropes as lessons. "You will not be alone," Elvira said quietly at the end of one evening, after they had enumerated routes and names and the basic timing of an act. "And if it breaks, I will sign the papers and put them where those who are left can see them. I will meet them in the square. I will make sure the Soba knows what I intend. I will speak with the one who will stand by me." They both understood that words alone would not protect them. Alliances would have to be made, quietly, with men and women who held their own sets of influence. The Soba who could call warriors, the merchants who would not see their business ruined by renewed violence, and those who were looking for reasons to be rid of Rodrigo's harsh ways without being ruined themselves. Nzinga slept little in the days that followed. He moved through the fields with a new weight to his steps, one that felt like a ledger of obligation. He watched Rodrigo from afar, the colonel's gait a map of small cruelties, the way he barked orders and expected obedience as if it were law. He watched men shift their bodies away from the colonel's path, eyes cutting to see who followed who. Around them, the plantation kept on producing. The corn grew, blunted by wind and insect, and the workers sang as they planted and harvested songs that had nothing to do with the Casa Grande's etiquette. Children chased one another in the newly fenced garden. Older women carried water from the well and kept the nets. Life persisted, threaded with small resistances. When the day came for Elvira to begin signing the first papers, a hush seemed to lay over the fields as if the whole land were catching its breath. She signed in a room with a window that looked toward the baobab, the old tree that had become both an instrument of shame and a mark of something else to come. She placed the first manumission in the hands of the steward who had maintained lists for Rodrigo, and then another and another, until a stack of papers lay in the steward's palm like a small storm. Word traveled strangely in such places, faster than anyone expected, and slower across the coffee-stained faces of men who had not yet been given names. Some men laughed and accused her of jest. Some fell to their knees and wept because the idea of legal freedom felt impossible, as remote as the ocean. Others looked at Nzinga as if he had somehow conjured miracles. That night, the household was quieter than usual. Rodrigo came back from his ride with a grin that did not reach his eyes, unaware of threads being arranged around him. He drank heavily as he always did to smooth the parts of him that thought the land owned him. He had enemies, the rich always do, and to be rid of him would please some while terrifying others. Antonio Ferreira, who ran the trading house in the neighboring district and whose ships took in persons and made fortunes on their backs, did not smile when he heard the rumor. He called for his men more out of habit than outrage, but habit is a force that can become action. The network of patronage, the men who had stood with Rodrigo when reputations were on the line, was not easily undone. Nzinga began to meet with a few trusted laborers in secret, men who could keep the quiet, who had seen enough to not be startled by the idea of turning a tool into an instrument of something other than production. They spoke in the language of small tactics, the hours guards changed, the ways ropes were lashed to gates, how to train bodies to be still and then suddenly not still. The more practical plans they made, the more the moral debate receded into the background, replaced by the gritty arithmetic of risk. At night, Nzinga dreamed of Kalena and Ekawikui as if they were waiting at the edge of a field with a basket of fruit and a small schoolbook. In his dreams, their hands were warm, and the world was a place where a name and a patch of earth meant safety. When he woke, he thought of Elvira's signature and how it might become a thing more powerful than the men who had for years thought that the only law was force. He understood one bitter truth. If they acted, the act would be read in many tongues. It would be an affront to those whose lives depended on the receipts of cruelty. It would also be a liberation no paper could fully secure until law and time did their work. He had to prepare not only for the act itself, but for the mornings after, the weeks of translation from deed to reality. Before dawn on the day they chose to test a first piece of the plan, a petty sabotage of a stirrup on one of the horses used by the colonel's servants, Nzinga walked to the baobab alone. The tree had a ribbon of rope scarred into its bark where the first lesson had been fixed. He pressed his forehead against the rough and felt the knowledge of those who had planted it. He murmured Kalena and Ekawikui's names, a small litany, not to magic, but to memory, the only altar he had that kept the dead from being swallowed by absence. When he returned, the stable was stirring. He worked as always, hands moving with the muscle memory of years, but now his fingers hovered in places longer than was necessary. He found himself thinking of what the papers in Elvira's hand promised, not merely freedom, but the building of schools, the naming of births, the effort to make life bearable and meaningful beyond reproduction. Fruit, he decided in that moment beneath the stable's thatch, could be anything that fed more than a single family line. They were ready to try a small thing first, a night with subtle misdirection, a cautious attempt to test how much trust they could muster from the men who worked, to see whether fear or hope would win the morning. The stirrup was loosened and then retightened in a way that suggested no harm. It was a rehearsal rather than a blow, an experiment to measure consequence. In the morning, Rodrigo mounted his horse without noticing. He rode out as usual, full of good humor and the kind of begrimed self-assurance that made him dangerous. Nzinga watched him go until he became a dark dot against the land. The stirrup held. When the colonel's laughter reached the tree line, the morning flew like a bird released from a hand. The test had not been violent, and yet it had changed something in the way the caretakers moved. They watched their tools differently. They had learned that things could be altered, that the order of the plantation was mutable. But the experiment also brought a new fear. Someone else had noticed. A stable hand with a habit of watching the house for signs of gossip had seen shadows where there should have been none, and had told another, and that had reached ears that did not belong to their small circle. Rumor is a living animal. It is fed on whatever shade it can find, and once fed, it grows teeth. Elvira's signature sat in the steward's office like a detonator waiting on a shelf. The promise of land and schools and names had been spoken aloud to a handful of workers who could hardly believe their ears. Yet even among the freed, disbelief mixed with suspicion. They had seen offers before, grants that evaporated, or means that were redirected into the colonel's pockets. Freedoms without structure are often fragile and strange. They can look like gestures meant to reconfigure labor into a different kind of enterprise, or they can be genuine. Which would this be? The next evening, as a storm came up from the coast and the sky opened into a hard, cold anger, Nzinga found Elvira by the baobab again. Wind ripped at her skirts and threw their hair into one another's faces. The tree held steady, indifferent to human virtue or vice, its roots anchored in centuries of weather. "We have little time," she said, the wind stealing her breath in quick bursts. "They are asking questions. Antonio will sniff at any change that threatens his cargo. He will not stay quiet if opportunity knocks." Nzinga had prepared himself for a war of small things. He had not prepared himself for the way his hands shook at the thought of others dying because they chose liberty. He had not prepared himself for the clarity that came with being the instrument of other people's fates. He felt for a moment like a man standing on the lip of a river, ready to dive and not sure how the water would take him. "Do not think I come to you for glory," Elvira said suddenly. "I come because I cannot stand the tree that bears witness to shame. I will not have that baobab be a ledger of our small cruelties. Help me rearrange the ledger." The metaphor of the ledger made Nzinga feel both the weight of what they planned and the possibility of its being rewritten. He thought of how many documents had been written to make men property, to count them as produce. To write a different set of documents might be a way to unmake those old entries. He thought of the Soba and the ways alliances could be drawn like lines in the sand. They agreed to take a step further, secure a small group, make contact with Soba Kambandu through a trusted messenger, and test loyalty with a non-violent mission. Move a small supply of tools under cover of night to the North Field. If Soba Kambandu's men would assist, they might have an ally who could be trusted in a crisis. As Nzinga walked back to his quarters beneath a sky that had been scrubbed clean by rain, he could feel the world changing in a pattern he could not fully map. He had seen cruelty taught as lesson. He had witnessed the circle of property and honor that made the rope possible. He had accepted a pact with an unlikely ally, a woman who had been both his owner and the target of the same social cruelty she now wanted to undo. They had not yet crossed the line that would make Rodrigo's falling the center of an account book. They had not yet tasted the morning when freed men would choose whether to stay on land reborn as community or to leave for the unknown. But the first small acts had been ordered and the first documents signed, and both of those were, in their way, a kind of planting. That night Nzinga dreamed of fruit, of hands he did not know reaching into trees and pulling down abundance, a kind of impossible harvest from soil that had been starved for generations. He woke with his palms sticky from sleep and thought of the baobab and the rope scarred into its bark. The scar would not go away, but perhaps it could be covered by something else, by names, by children who would grow with legal identities, by schools where people would learn to write their own stories. Dawn would bring the small mission to the North Field and the message to the Soba. It would also bring the colonel back to his rounds, smiling with the unawareness of men who believe their hour will never come. Nzinga walked to the window and watched the fields breathe. He held the papers in his hand once more and felt the grain of the ink like seeds. He thought of Kalena and Equikui and, for the first time in many years, allowed himself the terrible, dangerous promise that they might have more than ghostly memory. He stepped into the day with that promise like an ember in his chest, unsure whether it would burn bright or fade into ash. Dawn folded itself over the fields like a breath held too long. Nzinga moved through the rows with his body already engaged in the day's work, but his mind placed every footfall as if it were part of a more deliberate choreography. The small mission to the Northfield was simple in its mechanics and enormous in what it would mean. A test of trust, an offering to a man who had once ruled these parts with a heavy palm. They were to move tools by night, to show the Soba that people could act together and keep a secret, and to measure whether the handful of men who knew would behave as citizens or as frightened subjects of rumor. He rode out with a small bundle, more nerve than instrument. The path to the fringe where Soba Kambondu kept his modest court ran along a line of marshy reeds and a battered ox track. The Soba's compound was a cluster of reed-walled houses, a place which smelled of smoke and coffee beans and the iron of spearheads stored for seasonal wars that were both ancient and practical. Soba Kambondu received Nzinga with a calm that belonged to a man whose authority was older than any single colonel's paper. He wore simplicity like armor, a cloth draped over his shoulder, a belt of beads gathered at his waist. His face bore the weight of decisions, not as cracks, but as maps. Nzinga knelt to speak plainly. He did not parade rhetoric. He told of the hanging, of the rope at the baobab, of the forged idea that a woman's value could be measured by children she had not borne. He named the colonel and the man who moved ships, the names that mattered in both markets. Soba listened, palms resting on the carved haft of his spear. "You ask me to choose?" Soba said finally. His voice was low and certain. "You ask me to put my men where a colonel used to command? That will mean movement. It will mean risk. Why risk it for a woman who stood in the house that owned you?" Nzinga felt the memory of the stable's dimness rise like hot air. "Because she stood where cruelty made her stand," he said. "Because a thing that begins as punishment will become instruction unless it is stopped. Because the land is tired of being counted in chains." The Soba's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with measure. He thought of his own people, of the traders who once passed through and promised things that died with the tide. He thought of how a small band of warriors might be used to protect a neighborhood or to enforce a dealer's whim. In the end, he agreed, not because he liked Elvira or because he trusted strangers, but because he measured that a stable life in which merchants and colonels set a permanent scale of loss could become a scale set against his own people. They shook hands, a binding of sorts, and word was sent through the Soba's messengers. The Northfield moved its tools under cover of night. Men who had been asked to risk much did so with quiet competence. The message back from Kambondu came short and clear. He would stand with them when asked. He would bring warriors if the hour required them. The pledge steadied Nzinga the way a hand might steady a trembling vessel. The next steps were smaller and more terrible. They tightened a strap here, loosened a buckle there, arranged for a particular lantern to be dimmed within precise hours. They planted a small bluff for the colonel's stableman, a misdirection that would make a mechanical failure feel like a private misfortune rather than a crafted end. Elvira kept the parchment folded on her chest, as if the ink itself had become a talisman. The night they chose was clouded and thick, the moon a crescent that left men to judge by smell and memory. Rodrigo favored the same route when he rode to chase some imagined slight or to feel the wind throw off his guilt. That night the house held its breath. The stable hands moved as though on instinct. A small, carefully placed obstruction startled a horse near the ridge where the land narrowed and hid gullies in dark. The animal bolted. Rodrigo, heavier with drink and escapist bravado than usual, lost his balance. He fell hard, the ground taking him with a sound like broken wood. His horse panicked and galloped for cover. They found him at first light. The scene was ugly but not cinematic. A man who had permitted ugliness everywhere in his life lay still. There was no triumphant cry. Men gathered with numbed faces, some in disbelief, some in sick relief. Words scrambled for meaning. Accident, misfortune, the kind of thing that happens to men who drink and ride. Elvira's ring finger went cold with a tremor as she watched from the Casa Grande doorway. Nzinga kept his back to the wall as if the plaster itself might speak. There was a funeral, as there always was for men of a certain rank. The neighbors came with measured sympathy. They draped shawls and spoke of a life complicated by service and vocation. Antonio Ferreira's face was a study of unfolding calculation. He did not cry, he catalogued. He watched the plantation's vulnerabilities the way a creditor watched a ledger, looking for weaknesses to profit from. Elvira did what she had sworn she would do. At dawn, she walked to the village square beneath the baobab that had once borne witness to her humiliation. She had the papers with her, a bundle of deeds and names that she had the legal right to sign. She read them aloud. Each name named. Each name received a short benediction from a man who had never thought the sound of his own name could be law instead of ledger. Men wept and laughed and cursed in one breath. A handful who had been sold or hired to distant lands felt the names as if anchoring them back. From this day, Elvira declared, voice steady, those who have labored here will be named in law and in heart. No longer will the hand of any man count their births as property. Here are papers. Here is land. Here is a promise. Some did not believe. One elderly man spat into the dust and asked whether a woman who had been owned could bind justice with ink. Nzinga stepped forward and handed that man a small token, a nameplate that would mark the beginning of a field his family had tended for years. The gesture meant more than paperwork. It translated the paper into something lived, a piece of ground and the obligation to defend it. The announcement fractured the countryside into quick currents. Those whose fortunes were tied to the old order, Antonio among them, murmured. They would not stand idly by while a precedent eroded profit. The merchant called in debts. He wrote urgent letters. He booted men into action, men who could be paid to ride and to harry and to make claim. The morning's jubilation became a narrowing lane of apprehension. Antonio's first move was legal threat and rumor. He sent emissaries to the colonial magistrate, to men who kept the world in narrow accounts. He painted Elvira as an unstable woman, whose grief had made her reckless. He suggested that the man who had fallen had been set upon by conspirators. He framed the freed as dangerous. The magistrate, a man dependent on both coffee shipments and quiet afternoons, wrote letters and sent emissaries to ask questions. Those questions formed the shape of a possible siege, a legal censure combined with the practical threat of hired men. Nzinga had expected this. He had not expected, however, the way a community could be shaken by gossip. Some of the freed wanted to leave before the dangers consolidated. Fear makes people seek safety, even if it is uncertain. Others wanted to stay precisely because this was the field they had known. Elvira, for all her pledged papers, had to win hearts as well as registered beads. She walked among tents and sheds and the newly forming rows of houses and listened. To the women who feared for their children, to the men who worried about guns, to the old who wanted to keep the traditions that were not printed on parchment. They formed a council, perhaps the first of its kind on such land, a gathering that included Nzinga, a few respected workers, Elvira, and 2 elders from the surrounding hamlets. They argued late into the nights about whether to arm the fields, whether to seek the Soba's protection openly, whether to send envoys to merchants who might feel threatened by instability. They planned stores of food and organized watch shifts and brought in carpenters to reinforce gates. The life they were creating required old instincts and new bureaucracy at once. When Antonio advanced with hired men, it was not with the thunder of a full-scale invasion, but with the kind of force that could make life miserable, burn a few outbuildings, seize stock, intimidate. He assumed that fear would make bargaining possible. His men arrived in small groups at odd hours, looking for signs of weakness. They threatened the newly freed, breaking a window here, stealing a cart there. They sought to make staying unbearable. Soba Kambandu answered with a demonstration of solidarity that spoke more of rootedness than of conquest. He arrived not with the thunder of an invading army, but with banners and men who knew the land and who refused to be bribed by merchants. They occupied the ridge where any force would have to pass, but they also set up lines of negotiation. Kambandu did not want to fight. He wanted to assert a principle. This land was not a private ledger for any man to write his whims upon. On the morning Antonio's men tried to trespass the eastern fence, they found a slender but resolute line of Soba warriors and villagers who had learned to use the land's concealments. The encounter was a standoff, words thrown over a small field like nets. Antonio's men made a show of brandishing pistols, but the sight of children and elders moving among the defenders, of the Soba speaking quietly with a merchant whose vessels had exchanged goods with him years ago, suggested consequences too heavy to ignore. News of a full conflict could damage trade, could invite colonial courts, and disturb the quiet that made currency flow. Antonio's men were not foolish enough to gamble on every possible threat. The standoff resolved not with a sharpened blade, but with a bargain that preserved the plantation's new status, at least for a time. Antonio withdrew and nursed his grievances, muttering of debts unpaid and promises broken. He would return, but for now he conceded that profit did not thrive where shooting and law courts met. He could not openly assault a community that had Soba Kambandu's endorsement without risking merchants who preferred predictable ports and import-export ledgers. The victory felt precarious. Nzinga knew the victory's shape. It was not the end of a war, but a reprieve that came with obligations. The freed now had to show that freedom could be more than a word by conducting themselves with steadiness enough to withstand the merchant's pressure. They had to make the land both productive and generous enough that even those who might profit by sowing discord might find another convenience in peace. For all the political calculations and quiet showdowns, the human cost remained raw and private. At night, when the day's duties subsided and the village came together under lamps and the occasional glow of a brazier, Nzinga allowed himself to feel the weight of the man's death. He found no pleasure in it. Rodrigo had been a cause of cruelty, yes, but death had a way of dulling the righteousness of any act with the same inevitable sorrow. Nzinga's sleep was a thin, restless thing for months. He dreamed of Kalena and Equiqui, and of the rope scar and the baobab, and of Elvira's face when she signed the papers. He did not let himself feel triumphant. If anything, his mind kept asking what price had been paid, and whether it was paid enough. Public rituals helped the community manage grief and legitimize the new order. They refused to stage Rodrigo's death as revenge. There was no triumphal display. Instead, they held a small ceremony at the baobab for the living, a planting of a slender row of saplings, a pledge to the names newly written, and a vow that the tree would be used now to teach a different lesson. The Soba spoke of law and hospitality. Elvira spoke to the freed with a voice shaped now by work rather than by defense. They brought the people together to sign a charter in which obligations were reciprocal: protection for land, land for labor, and education. Over the following years, life took the shape of steady hands and deliberate projects. The school rose in the Northfield, a simple building with a clay floor and benches worn by many hands. Children gathered there and learned to sound their names on the page. The first teacher was a woman who had escaped to the town years earlier. She returned for a wage that was small, but paid with a conviction that what she taught would change more than individual lives. The clinic was a humble room with a trained nurse and a chest of medicines, pooled from merchant contributions and community labor. The cooperative was organized not as a charity, but as an enterprise in which profits would be shared and decisions made collectively. Elvira was an unlikely administrator. Where once she had kept her feelings folded neatly and used smiles as currency, she now moved among people with the bluntness of someone who had been stripped of pretense.
She contracted workers' committees, appointed a steward to manage shared resources, and pushed to ensure that land grants were recorded in local registries. She negotiated with merchants for reasonable access to markets and with sobas for rights to graze animals and to secure routes. Her position in society altered painfully. She had enemies who called her names and friends who visited with bundles of grain. The house that had once been a symbol of dominance became, over time, a place where petitions were heard and where a woman who had once been humiliated now stood publicly when asked. The freed did not all stay. Some could not bear the memory of crop lines or felt safer seeking a shore or a town where the anonymity of life would seem a balm. Others dug in. They planted orchards where once, for generations, they had harvested only what was counted by others. Fruit trees, mango, guava, citrus, were chosen for their promise of slow, steady yield. Children bound to these trees in play would eventually climb and harvest with hands that could name themselves. Soba Kambandu became more than an ally. He became a partner in governance. He taught negotiation and the ways of neighboring peoples who had to live together.
He reminded them that land is kept by consensus as often as by force, and that a people who could persuade their neighbors to trade and share would be stronger than one who relied only on walls and guns. His men trained interested villagers in basic defense, not to attack, but to organize, to protect, and to show enough force when necessary that petty aggression would not be worth the cost. Antonio did not vanish. His vendetta simmered in trade routes and small legal machinations. He financed men who tested the fences, who tried to stir old resentments and to bribe those whose loyalties wobbled. On one bitter morning, a night raid set 2 outbuildings aflame. The fire took no lives, but it took tools and stock and the small store of seed for the upcoming season. Men from neighboring settlements came to help, to carry water, to rebuild. The community's ability to answer loss with mutual labor and protective networks made the next raid a poor investment for Antonio. The merchant's hired hands found only a people who had seen the edge and declined to jump. Years bent the land into a new rhythm. Harvests came and sometimes failed, as harvests do, but the people who lived there began to experience a kind of return. Children with names wrote in the school register. A midwife taught younger women how to read medical leaves. Farmers shifted from monoculture thinking to rotation fields that allowed more sustainable yields. The cooperative trade brought modest profits that were invested in a small granary and a well. They started a memory practice. Each year, on the day Elvira had cut the papers free, they gathered at the baobab to sing and to plant a sapling. The ritual grew siblings: a day to teach, a day to repair, a day to inscribe names. Nzinga's role evolved. He was respected not by title but by history. He had been the man who cut a rope and then stood to build. He taught people the art of vigilance, how to notice the small things before they unraveled into disaster, how to measure rumor, how to keep guard without becoming a people of suspicion. He had become a man of projects, maps of fields, lists of births, the occasional negotiation with a merchant who needed a favor or a soba who needed a grain contribution. He stayed close to Elvira in the way a friend does, offering candor when asked and distance when not. There was no public romance between them. Their partnership was a different intimacy: shared danger, shared vows, shared public action. The years also softened Elvira. The white hair that threaded through her dark hair made her face less masked to the world. She laughed sometimes in public, with an ease that surprised those who had known her younger. She never forgot the humiliation of the rope. She turned its memory outward into a mission. She used the house as a place where people could petition grievances and where she would sign deeds and see to the registration of births. When poor neighbors came with claims about theft or land, she listened. Her pledge to keep her word had become habit. The grave cost she had incurred, the killing of a man, The inevitable pain of those ripples clung as an ache at the center of her. She did not seek absolution at a church. She sought to refill the ledger of the world with small acts of benefit. Decades advanced with the modest accumulation of habit. The children who learned to read under the Northfield School grew into elders with their own children. They married across lines that had once been forbidden. They taught their offspring that a name matters because it makes one a person before the law, before trade, before any man's ledger. They articulated the idea that fruit meant more than bloodlines. It meant the fruit of shared effort and dignity. There were seasons of tension, too. A colonial administrator once visited under the auspices of inspecting trade routes. He asked questions about deeds and titled land and whether the manumissions were legal in the strict Portuguese sense. Elvira, older and steadier now, presented the papers and the witnesses. She had hired one of the few local scribes who understood how to transcribe with careful grammar. The administrator found it inconvenient, to be sure, and filed a report that shadowed their papers for a time. But the reality of a stable, prosperous planting that supplied goods to ports made the cost of confiscation high. The Soba and a scattering of merchants who preferred predictable partners lobbied for the status quo. Elvira's careful bookkeeping and the community's new economic contributions created a pragmatic reason for the colonial officers to avoid disruption. Nzinga watched the life he had helped birth mature, and he felt the familiar ache that had been his steady companion. The moral calculus that had sent him to tamper with a saddle remained an open question. The taking of a life had consequences that no charter or school could erase from one's conscience. He was not absolved. He taught his children, other people's children who sought him as mentor, the difficulty of choosing when laws are unjust and when action calls for hard measures. He told them, with a firmness that never dulled, that courage and care must live together. He told them of Kalena and Equiqui not as trophies of memory, but as reasons to make sure memory could produce something living. Elvira's final years were quiet in public and private in complicated ways. She fell ill with an ailment no simple remedies could cure. The clinic's nurse and the Soba's healer worked together. Nzinga sat at the edge of the bed on a day when the light cut through the curtains like slats of truth. She reached for his hand with a force that surprised him. "We planted seeds," she said, voice a soft thing that had the steadiness of old wood. "You taught them to name themselves. Promise me you will keep teaching the children why names matter." Nzinga felt his throat tighten. He had been the one to make the pledge in a stable years before, but now the ask was personal and final. He squeezed her hand and made the promise not as one who makes vows lightly, but as one who is anchored to a life's work. "I will tell them your name," he said. "I will tell them how you signed and how you kept your word." She smiled, not a show of triumph, but a letting go. The community gathered beneath the baobab when she passed. Her burial did not mimic the colonel's pomp. It was a simple affair, a giving back of a life that had once been placed on public display for shame. They sang, and Soba Kambandu spoke of accountability and the need to hold the memory of wrong so that wrong would not repeat. A stone was placed at her feet with a simple inscription in Portuguese and in local tongue, a line that translated roughly as, "Here began the work of repair." Years continued, the slow work of seasons reshaping a people. Nzinga aged into a man whose hair was silver and whose hands showed the map of decades. He watched as his community learned to argue within law and beyond it, to keep a vigilance that did not become fear. He taught reading under the baobab in his later years, telling stories that mixed tactics with memory. Children sat cross-legged and listened to the man who had once been an instrument of daring and who had become, in time, a teacher of ethics. On the baobab's trunk, beneath the scar of the original rope, a plaque found place some years after Elvira's death. The inscription was careful, no boasting, no erasure. It read in measured lines, names, and a statement that transformed the old lesson into a new one. Where once the tree had been used to declare that a life without children was worthless, the plaque turned the phrase, Here was once turned a judgment that bound women to shame, it said. Here a different judgment was sown, that life bears fruit when it yields dignity and the right to be named. People came to read it and to leave small offerings, seedlings, coins, carved wooden spoons. The tree became a site of ritual once more, but this time its rituals were about care and remembrance. Nzinga lived long enough to see his face in the children who climbed the low limbs. He watched marriages and funerals, the bright and the bitter, and he carried the memory of the rope as a kind of scar that taught rather than pricked. He sometimes walked the perimeter of the land at dawn, hands in his pockets, thinking of how one decision had cascaded outward. He did not pretend it was simple. Men had died, vengeance had been possible, justice had taken a shape that required constant tending. On his final evening, gathered under the baobab with a small circle that included elders, former workers, Soba's descendants, and a few of the schoolchildren who had grown to be parents, Nzinga told a story. He did not recount the mechanics of the plan or dramatize the fall of a man. He spoke of names, of Kalena and Ekukui, of the rope, and of a woman whose name was once used to mark shame and was later used to open law. Fruit, he told them, was taught to us as an image of what matters. For some, fruit meant a child of their blood. For others, it became a way to count labor. We have taken that image and planted it differently. We have a harvest now that is not only for bloodlines, but for a common life. That is the fruit I would offer. Remember that when you must choose. They buried Nzinga where he asked, near the baobab and beside Elvira. The ceremony was not short of sorrow, yet it was not dominated by triumph. It held both grief and a quiet pride. The plaque they had affixed years prior was polished, and a small line was added beneath. May those who pass here remember that lives bear fruit in dignity, not only in blood. Years later, caravans and ships would pass and mention the Fazenda Ventura as a place where a model had been tried. There would be visits from reformers and curious merchants. Sometimes historians would try to pin legal dates and names to the events, and would argue over whether every deed had perfect documentation. The community learned to speak with patient truth. Some things were paper, some were practice, and both mattered. The plaque under the baobab held steady. The school ran each morning, and sometimes in the father's fields one could hear a child recite the alphabet, and then the names of the ancestors in the same breath, as if grammar and genealogy had merged. Children grew to be adults who, more often than not, chose to teach the next generation how to read their own names and how to reckon with what it meant when a man in power decided a life was worth less. The lesson leaned not toward vengeance, but toward repair. Reland, rename, reteach. When people came to tell the story in later years, they told it like a thing that had messy beginnings and clean continuations. Not because the world rinses clean, but because people chose to invest in the slow machinery of dignity. Sometimes they spoke of the decisive moment, the rope, the cutting, the sabotage, the fall. Sometimes they focused on the years, the school, the clinic, the orchards. Both were true. The hard choice that had been made carried consequences that had to be owned. The community acknowledged those costs in their rituals. The title that had once been a justification for humiliation, "Life without fruit isn't worth living," was no longer a sentence used to punish. It was, rather, a challenge they had inverted. Fruit, as they taught their children, was not the sole privilege of a particular house or surname. Fruit was the livelihood of shared effort, the right to be named, the school where a child learned to read their own history. The baobab, with its scar and its plaque, stood as both reminder and testimony, that a cruelty had been committed and that a different path had been taken. When visitors asked the elders what they would counsel a person who saw injustice, Nzinga would tell them the simple truth he had learned in seasons of hard labor and fear. One should not act from hatred, and one should not hide from responsibility. One must measure consequences, gather allies, and be ready to bear the cost of action. Elvira's papers were proof not of a single miracle, but of a prepared plan that accounted for mornings after. If there was a single memory that children kept at this place, it was of hands. Hands that cut a rope, hands that signed a paper, hands that turned soil into rows of fruit. They learned that hands could be instruments of harm and also instruments of repair. The community taught them to choose what to make with their hands. At the close of the story, as the sun set and the baobab cast a long, steady shadow over rows of planted trees, the voice that had watched and told all these events reached toward a simple, hard question. Not to offer doctrine, but to demand choice. When faced with the sight of an unjust act, with the rope already looped around someone's life, or the ledger open to count another person as nothing, what will you do? Will you walk by as if the world is only a ledger, or will you risk to alter the account? If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of the small things you can do to change the ledger where you live, tell us. When you have seen injustice, what did you choose? Share a time you acted, or a time you felt you could not. If this story mattered to you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear a tale of how dignity can be planted like fruit.